Northern Day in. Welcome to Viking Superpowers. I'm David Lovegrove. In today's episode, I got a really thrilling tale to tell you, and it's based on ancient stories written down in the 1200s in Iceland, based on research by the great historian and chieftain Snorri Sturluson, who was a friend of kings and received a lot of stories and wisdom from the poets and the royal families in Norway and possibly other families. And these stories have been kept for us in a number of books. These books are this one, Heimskringla. This is the first volume. It's the history of the Norse kings. And these two wonderful books. These are the Snorra Edda, Edda Snorri Sturluson, which is the book of stories and rules for poetry and how to write poetry and how to understand kennings and the ancient way of writing poetry, but specifically about preserving these great stories, which have been known as myths for a long time. The word myth, funny enough, comes from Greek, and it doesn't really mean a made-up story. It actually means an account. There's a very famous book by Plato in which he tells the story called the myth of Er, and that actually means the account of Er, or who was a soldier who died in a battle, and then on his funeral pyre, I guess before they lit it up, came back to life and told the account of the afterlife. It basically one of the first recorded detailed near-death experiences, and a very influential tale it was. But so this is about the myths in inverted commas. This one, Saemundar Edda, that's the old term for it. It's actually called the Poetic Edda in scholarly circles, and most people into the Vikings, including most of you watching this, will know that term. So the Prose Edda is what we call the other name for the Edda Snorra Sturluson. So I'm basing a story I'm going to tell you today on the stories written down in those three books. And you'll find it quite a wild story. It's really sounds like a science fiction script, something for Netflix. It's sexy, it's wild, and I see constant high tech in it. I see people, humanoids, but with superpowers, with what I call paranormal superpowers. So they're not really supernatural, they're not something that's outside the natural world, but they're superpowers, you might say, hidden in plain sight. And that's one of the major themes of my channel and my book coming up, Viking Superpowers, Way of Asgard, is about the superpowers that are innate in us as humans, and the superpowers that were innate and cultivated in ancient peoples who visited Earth. And I believe that they were human people, but from a long, long time ago, who came from somewhere else. And the whole narrative of paleo-contact that I find in the Viking writings, in the stories of the Icelanders and the stories of ancient peoples everywhere. So without further ado, I'll read you the story, the first part of it at least, and then we'll get into talking about where it comes from in these ancient writings. A long time ago, in the frozen northern motherland of Sweden, there lived a king who was also a great wizard. His name was Gylfi. He was a handsome man, powerful, intelligent, inquisitive and learned, and he cared about his people. One day, as he was riding about his kingdom, he came across a lone woman, cooking on a fire beside the edge of a forest. She looked up at him as he sat his horse, and he was taken aback by her incredible beauty and the fearless power of her eyes, strangely green eyes against a pale face and reddish blonde hair. Despite appearances, she was certainly no vagrant. He wondered what such a woman should be doing out alone in the wild, even in his kingdom, where he maintained law and order with a firm hand. He asked her who she was and where she came from. She simply answered, "I'm not from around here." Gylfi said, "Are you perhaps travelling from the northern way, or do you come from the east? I've never seen the like of you before." She replied, "I'm not from this earth." This puzzled Gylfi greatly, and he laughed. There was something very strange and yet extremely attractive about this young woman, and it was much more than just her looks. She had a very confident manner and an aura of command. He invited her to come to his household and feast with him. The woman surprised him by boldly leaping up and jumping up behind him on his horse and saying, "Fine then, let's go." He had beautiful clothes brought for the woman and a bath laid for her, and then that evening they were entertained by his best musicians, storytellers, singers, poets and jugglers. "Gefjon, I am called," she said, and asked him if he would like to take her to bed. King Gylfi happily agreed. After a night of incredible passion, he lay blissfully beside her in the royal bed, watching her sleep, and he thought to himself, "This woman is surely a princess or even a goddess." When Gefjon awoke, he said to her, "Is there anything I could give you as a gift?" She replied, "I do have a request, King. If it would please you, I would ask that you give me a gift of as much land as I can plough in a day and a night." This seemed an extremely modest request, and the Wizard King thought that this would please him very much, as he would like to keep this woman close to him. Perhaps she may assent to become his wife. So he granted her request, and went out to organise a team of oxen and a plough for her. When he returned, Gefjon had disappeared, and he was both surprised and disappointed. She had her own ideas about oxen and ploughs, and had quickly left the fortress on King Gylfi's best horse, having resumed her old travel clothes and galloped to where she had hidden her own means of transport. Flying far to the north, she landed in the snow-covered compound belonging to an old lover, one of the powerful people called the Jotun. He was very pleased to see her, and they also spent a night of passionate bliss, and in the morning he asked her if there was any special favour he could do for her. Gefjon said, "I have a little ploughing to do, and I would like to borrow 4 of your largest earth-moving machines, and 4 of your most experienced drivers." The Jotun roared with laughter and asked her what mischief she was up to. She smiled and headed out to organise the earth-moving team and the airlift back to southern Sweden. When she and the team arrived the next morning at daybreak, she had directed the 4 drivers to set the enormous machines to plough deeply into Gylfi's land. The 4 machines worked all day and night, billowing with steam, and each one mounted with 2 giant lights each. As they dug deep into the land and became fully loaded, the airlift craft took the huge load of each machine westwards out into the sea and deposited the rocks and soil in the Sound off Denmark. By the end of the night, they had created the island of Zealand, once known as Sealand, where Copenhagen stands today. The massive hole that they left in Sweden quickly filled up with water and became known as simply the lake. King Gylfi, along with all the people who had lived where the lake had been dug, and most of the countryside round about, had fled before the great noisy monstrous oxen, and stood at a distance, watching in absolute astounded wonder. The Wizard King realised that he'd been grandly duped, yet he was bursting with the wonder of this woman, and the fearsomely extraordinary feat she had just performed. Gefjon walked up to his fortress, and he had the doors opened to her, and he and all his people bowed before her. They sat down to drink together, and Gefjon told him that she was one of the Aesir, the Rain, the powerful ones of Asia. She revealed that she'd been sent by her commander on a mission to build a new base near to his new home base on Odin's, the island of Odense. The commander and a large contingent of Aesir and their families had already migrated from Alsgard, that we call Asgard, in Asia Minor, and had settled first in Garthariki, now Russia, then in Frankland, now France, and Saxland, now northern Germany, as well as Denmark. Gylfi was trying hard to take all this in. He asked in a low voice, "Who are you people? And how can you be so incredibly powerful? What on earth were those massive, magical, steaming, roaring, bright things you used to gouge that vast amount of earth from my land?" Gefjon smiled. "Oxen. 4 oxen to plough me a new field. I borrowed them from a friend up in the frozen north, and I had 4 of my sons come and help me with it." Gylfi felt deeply afraid of this beauty now, and was convinced that she was indeed a goddess. "If I may ask, great lady, is your magic and power in yourself, or is it because of the powers of the gods you worship?" Gefjon said simply, "Why don't you go and ask the commander yourself? He has established a base here in the north, and it's not overly far for a king like you to travel. He has left old Asgard under the rule of his 2 brothers, whilst he is here. I will make you a map. You will need all your courage, and for a mere man you have plenty, and you are a wizard, so you yearn to know the great secrets of life. So terrifying as this journey might well be for you, it will be worth it. The commander and my Aesir brothers and sisters will show you and let you experience our power. Will you travel with me, great lady?" King Gylfi asked. She kissed him and shook her head. She laughed. "I have great things of my own to do on my own new island. I will stay, but I promise I will not do any more ploughing in your realm." The wizard king laughed, yet felt a thrill of apprehension. This woman, these people, were so much more powerful than he or any other king of the north, wizard or not. He was, however, excited to go and meet the commander and his brothers and his sisters, and see for himself this fortress of the powerful ones, the Aesir. He put his best people in charge of his kingdom and told them not to interfere with this woman for their own safety. He kissed her goodbye, realizing by now she would never be his. With the strangely beautiful map she'd made in his hand, he set off. So that's a pretty exciting, sexy story, isn't it? That's part 1. So now I'm going to show you where this story comes from in these original sources. So we start off with Heimskringla, which Snorri Sturluson wrote back in the early 1200s in Iceland. It's called the History of the Norse Kings, and these early stories are generally considered mythical, not to be trusted historically, whereas I personally find within them really exciting, interesting historical stories and memories that really mustn't be forgotten, because even if they come across as strange and wild, that doesn't mean that they didn't happen. And that's part of the whole point of my channel, is to sort of say life is not what you think it is. Life is much more than you think it is. So this is in Ynglinga Saga, and I'll just read a little bit in Norse and then I'll read it in English. So it's talking about Odin coming north from old Asgard, which is in around Anatolia, and moving with all these, well, heaps of his people, the Aesir and the priests who are called the Dir. All these people moved up through the world into Russia, Garthariki they called it, Frankland, which became France, Saxland, which became Saxony, northern Germany, and then up to Denmark and Sweden and Norway. Þá fór hann norður til sjávar og tók sér bústað í Edni. Þar heitir nú Óðinsey í Fjóni. Þá sendi hann Gefjon norður yfir sundið í land að leita. Þá kom hann til Gylfa og gaf han hen plogsland. Þá fór hon í Jotunheimar og gat þar 4 sonu við Jotni nokkrum. Hon brá þeim í Yxnalíki og ferði þá fyrir plógin og dró landið út á hafið og vestur gegn Óðinsey og það kölluð Seland. Þar byggði hon síðan. Hennar fekk Skjöldur, sonur Óðins. Now, if you don't speak Norse or Icelandic, you won't know what I just said. So I'll leave that last bit untranslated because it's a little bit of a spoiler. But I'll just read to you what that means in English. It said, then he, Odin, went north to the sea and took up residence on a certain island. That island is now called Óðinsey. A means island. Odin's island, or Odin's sanctuary, this is calling it, Odense, on Fjon, which is now called Finn, F-Y-N. Then he sent Gefjun north over the sound in search of lands. She came to Gylfi, and he gave her 1 plough land. Then she went into Jotunheimar, which is typically translated as Jotun means giants, but it actually, they're not giants the way we think. It's hard to tell who they are because like the Vanir, like the Aesir, the Jotun seem to be able to mate with humans. So the Aesir can mate with humans and produce children. The Aesir and the Vanir can mate, which sort of indicates that they must be some kind of human type. And the Jotun also can mate with the Aesir, the so-called gods. So it looks like they're all the same genetic mix with obvious differences that we don't really quite know about. We just have to look for the clues to this. So she goes up to Jotunheimar, the world of the giants, and it says, had 4 sons with a certain giant. So she does this pretty quick. She had 4 sons, and then this says, she changed them into the form of oxen and put them to the plough. And that's where I read this strange word, Yxnalíki, og ferði þá fyrir plógin. I travelled then, or went then to the ploughing, but Yxnalíki means into the likeness of oxens. So that's pretty weird, you know, having 4 children sort of really quickly with this Jotun and then changing them into the form of oxens. That's really, you know, just the weird mythological stuff that people expect out of these stories. But I see these stories as a mixture, and I'll talk more about this, but I think these stories have 2 streams. They talk about a layer of very ancient spiritual stories that I think have great meaning, profound meaning, and this amazing big thick book, The Seed of Yggdrasil by Maria Kvilhaug, a Norwegian lady. It's just brilliant. I love big thick books, and it's all about the spiritual, mythological, initiatory meaning of these stories of the gods, both in Snorri and in the older Poetic Edda, and in, you know, Heimskringla saga, in the Heimskringla stories and other things. But that's a profound level of meaning, but I'm not getting into that, not at this juncture. My interest is in such things, but particularly for the moment in this channel, I just want to look at the other thing, which is this idea of paleo contact, which I feel really has legs, literally. I think this is a story of paleo contact that I'm finding in the sagas, and I'm not the only one to ever think this. History Channel actually made a whole lot of stuff about this a fair while ago, conjecturing this. So, and I didn't get the idea from them. I just found them after I'd been right into it for a while and went, oh, they're thinking about this too. This story is that aspect of the stories that people often get their knickers in a knot about and accuse Snorri of being a rabid Christian. Even they call him a priest, which he was nothing like that. I don't even believe he was a Christian. I believe he was a pagan who saved, because he's a very, very powerful chieftain. He's a very smart guy, and he's friends with the King of Norway and Earl Hakon, I think, Jarl Hakon. I'm pretty sure that's who it was. Off the top of my head, he saved these stories for us that had been curated and preserved by not only the ancient skalds, the poets, the storytellers and the old people who remembered, but also these royal lineages in Norway, Sweden and Denmark who preserved these stories. And I think what's hidden in the stories is this story that these weren't gods up in the heavens. They were actually beings who had incredible powers, who are beautiful, paranormally gifted, awesome, scary, sexy, mysterious beings. Getting back to the next book, and this book is called Gylfi, and here it is. And the story says, Gylfi konungur red thar Londum nu heitir Svithjof. King Gylfi was ruler in what is now called Sweden, Svithjof. Of him it is said that he gave a certain vagrant woman as a reward for his entertainment one plough land in his kingdom, as much as 4 oxen could plough up in a day. Now, here it says, Frá honum that sagt, about him was it said, at han gaf etni farandi konu, that he gave one travelling woman. She was travelling. She didn't have a land or a place to live in. At lonum skemtunar sinnar. Lonum actually comes from like loan. It means the payment for skemtunar sinnar, for the entertainment, one plough land in his kingdom. So, I mean, she might have entertained him by juggling 9 balls and standing on a head and barking like a seal, but I sort of doubt it. The feeling is that, you know, she's a pretty sexy lady and very forward and not embarrassed about her sexuality, and she's just said to him, hey babe, take a walk on the wild side. And next thing, he's offering her enough land that she can plough day or night. And what I like is it says en su kona var en af ausait, but this woman was one of the Ausa's family, the Ausa. Pretty mysterious, cool, powerful people. And she wasn't just some old vagrant. Hon neft Gefjun. She is named Gefjun. She took 4 oxen from the north, from giant land. I agree with it there. The sons of her and a certain giant. En that varu sinir jotun snokurus or hennar. Yeah, that was the sons from the giant or the Jotun, a certain one, and her. Og setti thou fyrir plough. I set them to the plough. And the plough cut so hard and deep that it uprooted the land, and the oxen drew the land out into the sea to the west and halted in a certain sound. A sound meaning, you know, sort of a great big area of water. There Gefjun put the land and gave it a name and called it Zealand, or Seeland. They called it here Selund. Where the land had been lifted from there remained a lake. This is now called Lake Matlar in Sweden. But what it literally says in here is Thater nu logrin Katlather is Svithjof, which means that is now the lake called in Sweden. It's just the lake. The lake. It's the lake. It's the one that something happened and something drew it out of there and just blew all our minds way out of the park. And it said basically the hole that was left filled up with water. An ancient poem by Bragi the Old, which basically says, Gefjon dragged with laughter from Gylfi, the liberal prince, what made Denmark larger, so that beasts of draught, the oxen, reeked with sweat. 4 heads they had, 8 eyes to boot, who went before broad island pasture, ripped away as loot. So it's a nice way of translating it. And in this translation, this one's by a famous scholar who I really like, Gene Young. And this is from back in the early 50s. This is 54. Gene Young, it's sort of a bit nondescript on the outside. This one, I've had this since I think the 90s. And I didn't sign it, but anyway, it's from the 90s. Its translation, it's worth saying this one because it talks about the kennings that are used, the poetic words that are used to describe this, which I find a lot of visual knowledge coming from. So it says, Gefjon drew from Gylfi, the wizard king, gladly a deep ring of land, which became the island of Zealand, which is where Copenhagen is in Denmark, so that from the swift pullers, and then it's got oxen in brackets, steam rose, Denmark's extension. So they're called swift pullers. It says the oxen wore 8 brow stars as they went hauling their plunder, the wide island of meadows and 4 heads. So when I read this initially in English, I thought, wow, like as a science fiction writer and an artist, I immediately thought 8 brow stars. I know it is a kenning for eyes, but I thought it sounds like big lights to me, you know, like massive lights. And I'm thinking the way people maybe 2,000 years ago would try to describe if they saw sort of Star Wars size earth moving machines with 2 big lights on it, like 4 machines with 2 big lights on the top. They'd think of those as stars, you know, at night. They'd just be so bright. There's nothing natural that's that bright. Even stars are not that bright, even the moon. And also this idea that steam rose from them. Well, you know, one doubts that they were steam engines, but they were undoubtedly producing heaps of heat and steam in the cold of Sweden, so, and Denmark, and the sound there. So there you go. I'll leave it at that. I hope you found that interesting. I'll continue on very soon with the next part of the story, and I hope you're hanging out for it because it's really good. It hots up even more and becomes quite mind-stretching. So I'll see you next time.